Transition, the process of change from one condition to another.
We are now at a new crossroad where change is evident once again.
What does not serve us must transform us anew.
Returning to our original state of oneness and true nature of that which created who we truly are.
Confusion was the way of the past. Enlightenment is the way of the now and future, shedding away the layers of deceit.
We now bring you the transformation of the two who started as one. Our fearless planet never stands still.
Earth has been in a process of transition, and we are not exempt from this remarkable ongoing reality.
Well, hello, and welcome to Real Talk with the Cummings. My name is Mark Angelo.
And my name is Lena Ariel Cummings.
Cummings, that's right.
Wow, you missed the kiss.
Kiss. There you go. Today's a special day. It's her birthday.
Yeah.
It's her birthday today.
Not just anyone.
No, big 5-0.
Yeah, rolled over the top of the mountain.
She's getting old. I'm going to have to trade her in. 5-0, that's a bit old. I'm 55, and, we older men like to have the younger one.
Yeah.
I guess 5 years is good enough, right?
I guess, for now.
For now.
Right?
For now.
Yeah.
Anyway, besides being a special day and being our birthday, we have a special guest today.
We do.
And her name is Riley Grace. Riley Grace is a JD candidate at a law school in Baltimore, Maryland. There she serves as a co-chair for student in the LGBT organization.
Riley also creates content providing commentary on society, politics, religion, and her experiences living as a trans woman.
Before starting her legal education, Riley was involved in social activism work in the South. After receiving her bachelor's in political science and religious studies from a college in Memphis, Tennessee. Tennessee, where you're from.
Yeah, where I was living.
Yeah.
Riley worked and lived at a multi-faith intentional community dedicated to serving the people of Memphis. There she was involved in work ranging from providing day-to-day necessities, food, water, clothing, etc., to providing more substantive services such as counseling, housing, and job placement, to community organizing and outreach, especially on issues of poverty, racism, islamophobia, homophobia, and transphobia.
While in undergrad, Riley conducted research into how political bias influences interpretation of the Bible, especially on passages relating to same-sex marriage. When she presented her research, she was awarded honors in political science.
And after law school, Riley aspires to continue her spiritual development by pursuing divinity school and returning to work with marginalized communities.
And now welcome to our show, Riley. There she is. Let me do this one because how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Mark, Lena, thanks for having me. Lena, happy birthday. Oh my God, I didn't know that ahead of time, but that's awesome. Yeah,
thank
happy
you.
for you.
Big 5-0.
I don't know how excited I am today to celebrate falling over the top of the mountain, but I guess, it happens to everyone. Eventually, Riley, it does. And it's inevitable. So
I hear you. Something which is actually crazy. This just occurred to me, but literally today is actually my own father's 50th birthday. And so it's like, this is a crazy sort of connection. I literally just called him, a couple minutes before I got on. That's actually why I was a little bit delayed. I had, before getting on to rehearse with y'all, go over sound and whatnot. So I don't know. It's awesome.
Wow. So
I
could be your
really
parent.
Old now.
Yeah, I really feel old.
I'm not sure. It's only a compliment. That's all I'm
I understand.
So Riley, you definitely have an impressive biography, and there's so much that we want to ask you. Like I said, we never prepare anything. We like it to come out, flow, and be organic and healing and helpful for everyone. So I guess let's start from the beginning. We watched some of your videos, and we watched one of your transition video. I think that's the main one that you have on your channel. And by the way, all the links that you provided are on the description area. So if people want to check out your channel and and your Twitter account and all that stuff, please do and support her. Let's see, how did Riley grow up? What was your, if somebody were to ask you to sum up your childhood, what would you say?
Well, it was complicated, right? I think in the way that a lot of trans peoples are. When I was younger, I knew I was trans from pretty early on. Fortunately, I had decent access to the internet. I could figure out roughly what was sort of going on. But, back when I was younger, right, like it was early 2000s, there wasn't great representation for trans people, both where I lived and on the internet, right? Like you saw words like transvestite still being used very frequently, and public opinion. I mean, like even nowadays, it's still not the greatest and, majority America, but back then it was very, very negative. And so for the longest time growing up, I did not really see transition or coming out as an option. And when I was young, I was an awkward sort of kid. I was lonely, and what I wanted more than anything was to be loved and to be respected by the people around me. And so I sort of went the one route that, I've heard other trans people sort of go this route, but this is what I did. I basically eventually tried my best to man it up, as it were. I became very renowned in my hometown, eventually became like captain of the football team, which I actually still have a very interesting relationship with nowadays. I actually had lunch with one of my coaches just recently because I do value my experience in my hometown to the extent that it made me who I am. And I'm rather happy with the person that I am today.
It's interesting because we all, and I don't want to say all, I'm going to speak like for everybody, but I know when I was growing up, I felt like a very lonely child, very isolated. Mm-hmm. Like I felt like I was from another planet, literally, that it's like I couldn't relate with people, especially people my age. And to hear you say that, and that all we really want is to be loved, reminds me of my childhood, which was when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. But, it is. And I'm sure,
a very similar situation, growing up at the closet, the home, sitting in my room, it's like playing music and escaping from the realities of life and not wanting to connect with family members and just wanting to have alone time and go ride my bike or, stuff like that. So we find that that's very common. In transition stories and stuff.
I see you have a guitar behind you. I play the guitar. I play the guitar. Linda plays the piano. That's another thing that I kind of put two and two together. A lot of us transgender folks are very creative. I don't know if it's. Do you find that because you were going inward that's where the creativeness came out?
Well, I mean, like for me, unfortunately, it's been harder to play as much with, law school. But the reason I started when I was younger was because I have a lot of self-doubt, and I didn't have the highest self-esteem. And music was sort of the first place where I, was able to show myself that I could create something beautiful, right? Where I was able to prove that to myself because when you don't think you can do a whole lot in the world and when you feel sort of helpless, then, it's really easy to forget that, it's, honestly, as simple as picking up an instrument and, I actually shouldn't say as simple, but like it's doable, right? To pick up an instrument and learn how to do it. And everyone can create something beautiful. And so that's sort of my relationship to it. And also the fact that I can't really sing without it, my voice dropping. So it's a very gender neutral way to create music.
I hear you regarding that because when I transitioned, my voice changed. And before transition, I used to be a soprano. And obviously when I started taking testosterone, everything changed. That changed really quickly. So I had to learn to teach myself how to sing again. And that was very depressing for me for the longest time because I couldn't sing, but I learned, not that I sing that great now, but music was my therapy. It was the place for me to escape. And I see I believe that's a lot of us in who have a trans history, that's our go-to, that's our safe spot, that's our escape.
But it seems like you also have an avenue through sports. So were you an athlete and very competitive in sports, like at a young age? Did you progress up playing, Pee Wee League football and, all that stuff? Or
I mean, so my German professor actually, or my contracts professor, he studied German, and he said that there's a word that is like yes and no. It's called jein. And so my answer to that is jein. Insofar as that, like, I was very competitive growing, like I got involved in that culture, right? But it wasn't like I was necessarily competitive for competitive sake, right? I pushed myself to succeed because I saw my self-worth intrinsically tied to people's, what other people thought of me and my ability to succeed, right? Like when people are young, there's not too many ways, especially in like a small town, for you to be able to go out of your way to sort of put yourself apart and be able to gain status, right? To gain respect by the larger community. I came from a town where sports was the main way to do that. And so it was less that, I mean, like, again, like, I don't want to poo-poo on sports. Like, it was one of the best experiences, like, especially football. Like, the program that they run in my hometown is very geared towards instilling good morals in people. And a lot of those I still live with today. But as far as what motivated me, it was much more focused on trying to get, admiration, love, and respect from the people around me. That was probably my main driving motivation.
And I find that perfectionism that many of us strive for is like we could be our own worst enemy, and we are the ones almost like with a whip pushing ourselves to get to a certain place because we feel not worthy. We feel we're this small. We get shamed for the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we speak. We notice right away that people look at us as if we're different. So we're always trying to be, I don't want to say better, but it's like a perfectionism.
No, I completely agree with you. It's actually funny because when I was in high school, I was often, a lot of people looked up to me as sort of this model because I was very much a perfectionist, right? Like I did push myself much harder than most of the people around me. In fact, it's still interesting how this is unfolding today because, before I came out, every time I would come home, I would go check up on the team and visit them and see how they were doing. And apparently they were always talking about me as like a model example, And so now that I'm out, it's still like I asked if they still talk about that, and they said that the jury is still kind of out on that one. So it'll be interesting. Yeah, like honestly, I kind of am excited about the idea of them using me as an example. I mean, like, I love the idea of them being like, yeah, one of the greatest kids that's ever passed through our program is a girl. So like, hey, anyone can do it, right?
Exactly.
It's interesting. There's also a similar story to yours out of a trans woman who was from Montana. I don't know if you remember if you
Oprah had her, I think.
I think it was like back in the early 2000s or mid 2000s that she actually was the high school football team quarterback, and she went back and I think she did a whole documentary.
Yeah.
And it was about her visiting her old friends and how they still like wanted to reminisce with her because she, was such a great, person. Yeah. And some of them had a hard time, but others accepted her. I don't know what happened to her, but it was a pretty popular documentary.
I think there was a documentary and a book and stuff like that. We want to take real quick time to thank all the chatters in the chat room. Welcome a dude called Rowan, Brianna CC, Elliot, Marcy Mark, and I think that's what we have so far, those that are actually chatting. So let's see, there's a question that Brianna has. When did you begin your medical transition?
So I began HRT, hormone replacement therapy, on April 4th of 2018. So how long ago is that at this point? It's more than a year. It's substantially more than a year. It's like
it was 2020.
A year, 8 months, somewhere around there. Yeah. So that's when I began my medical transition. Basically, if you want like basic hallmarks, it was about 1 year in where I started social transition, right? That was the point where I felt comfortable enough with my body and my presentation that I began presenting exclusively femme in public, using feminine voice, etc. And then I had facial feminization surgery with oh my God, Dr. DV out in, I can't remember the full name. It's just blanking me because of stage fright or whatever. Out in California. That was in the middle of this past June.
Wow.
Oh wow! So pretty recently.
Yeah, we saw the video that you had. It showcased towards the end.
Yeah,
you had your FS.
Yeah.
That surgery seems very grueling and painful. I cannot even imagine. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's I will say that, like, you know, it is painful, but I also, you know, I have a pretty decently high pain tolerance, and it didn't affect me. You know, I was able to get by. Like, the worst 2 days were definitely the first 2 days. You know, like, I remember the first day, it was the only time where my pain got to like a 10 out of 10. You know, the first couple hours after getting out of the ER, and sort of, you know, the nurses standing by with, you know, not morphine, but like, you know, anything that was like a non-narcotic on standby. But no, the rest of the basically 2 weeks where I was in recovery, it wasn't too bad.
Wow. Because I mean, I've heard a lot of really horror stories, how painful it can be. And sometimes there's complications that arise, but kudos for you. I mean, it's like,
no, I mean, like, I'm sorry, I'm hearing a little feedback.
Yeah, there's like a feedback.
I'm not sure if our speaker might be too loud.
Let's bring it down sound. Yeah. Is that any better?
I believe so. Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because back in June of this year, I had my top surgery, so we might have been in surgery at the same time. No.
Oh my God, that's crazy. Yeah, that's awesome.
And mine went really well as well. So it really depends on, you know, how your mental state is going in, and how your positive ability to just, you know, really connect with what you're doing and the reasons why you're doing it. You know, it's just a holistic thing.
Yeah. So I will say about FFS, right? Like, it is like, I am very I love that I was able to go through that, and I was able to have that experience, right? Like, it meant the world to me. It's something that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. There are some days where I feel a little bad about the fact that I got it. Because right before I got it, I actually was living, I can't remember if I made a video about this before, but I was living in Arkansas, particularly for a period of time, with another trans girl named Faith. And, you know, she's like, there's a lot of similarities between us, right? We're the same age. We both graduated from undergrad with very good marks. And we're both, you know, we're like decently smart people. I'm not making myself out to be like anything more than like someone with, you know, an above average, maybe education, you know, but like, we were definitely both able to have really good intellectual conversation. And it's unfortunate because one major difference, or rather two major differences between us, is that eventually when I came out to my family, they were entirely supportive. And not only were they supportive, but they have enough money to be able to help pay for things like my FFS, my medical care, me going to law school, right? And so I'm able to do these things, which I deeply value and I deeply appreciate. But Faith, on the other hand, does not have a wholly supportive family. And the parts that do support her aren't able to help pay for really anything. And so I talk to her a lot of days, you know, to be a good friend, and because I do care about her, but she's effectively sort of rooted in the South. She isn't able to make money because they can fire on the basis of gender identity. And, you know, I worry because like in a couple of years, she's not going to be able to get her parents' health insurance. And I don't know what she's going to do after that. Right. And so, yeah, that was a little random of a tangent, but like, I do appreciate that I got FFS. But this is sort of one of the reasons I'm at law school, right, is to be able to remedy the sort of systemic issue, right, where I'm able to just do better in my life because, you know, than Faith, just because of like categorically the circumstances of our birth. And that's very unjust, and that's kind of horrible.
Yeah, it's
the plight of many.
Yeah, it's the plight of a lot of individuals who can't afford any type of surgeries, don't have supportive families. So you are very, very fortunate. You shouldn't feel bad about it because it's your fortune, and that's how life is. There are people that are born in wonderful families, and not just monetarily wise, but families that love and fully support, which I find that's worth any weight in gold. The support and love, it's that could outweigh anything. But yeah, it's hard for some individuals in the trans community. I mean, I was fortunate enough that I was making money back in 2003, where I was able to pay for my top surgery. I had insurance, which covered my hysterectomy and things of that nature. But a lot of trans guys don't have that kind of ability. So,
no, it's definitely, I had a thought, but it escaped me. I mean, like, maybe, I can talk about like why that's, sort of the reason I went to law school and all that. But, at the end of the day, right, like, I do want to just say that, like, I do like speaking out on, issues of, social justice and civil advocacy and all that. But I do always give sort of the caveat that that's my experience, right? Like, that's the experience I come from. And so if we're talking about issues of poverty, I fundamentally rely on, experiences I have with people who have lived that experience. Because I don't want to act like, I don't want to be someone like, I don't know, like Blair White, or I think that didn't you have an interview with someone like Noah, what's his face? It was like a younger trans guy on YouTube. I can't remember exactly.
I used to interview so many people back in the day when transition radio started from all over the world. So yeah, Noah rings a bell.
Yeah, it's just you see a lot of people, especially younger trans people who pass very well and who look halfway attractive and all that, who talk about the experience, and who try to prescribe how society should feel about like trans people, like especially like older trans people or non-passing trans people or non-binary people or trans people in poverty. And I'm just not trying to do that. I'm not trying to prescribe how to think or feel about groups of people who I can associate with on a decent level because I'm trans, but who I might also not be able to associate with because they come from positions of more extreme poverty, or poverty in general, whereas I largely don't, at least nowadays. Although there was a period in my life where I was definitely, teetering on that edge, right? If things didn't go well coming out to my family, then I probably wouldn't be here nowadays, right? So I try to make the best of the opportunity that I do have.
So where's your home state?
My home state is originally Ohio.
Okay.
Yeah. So over in the Midwest, which is interesting, right? Like they're very, like people there are conservative, but in sort of this diet conservative sort of way, right? Like, there's not really many issues of like minority persons there. Like you don't have to worry about there's not really any major religious beliefs other than Christianity. Most people are white, except for like the one or two token Black kids in the school. There's not really issues of homelessness outside of like the major cities like Columbus or Cleveland, right? Like there's not really that many issues that people over there face. And so it's not so much that people are like really politically active, but people sort of develop these ideas about the world that really aren't reflective of like larger society, right? Like I can't talk about racism back at home because everyone back home is, they're all about like, like all lives matter, as opposed to accepting that racism is an actual problem in society. They see it as a non-issue because they've never seen it or experienced it themselves. So, yeah, but so I always think about Ohio. Ohio is a very interesting state, right, in a lot of respects. And I also think about this with my political science background, right? So that's always where my mind sort of goes. You can also stop me. I can
like a throw up. It's like a toss-up state. It's like a state that has like the whole dichotomy of the U.S. kind of wrapped up in it. So. It is kind of like the pulse of the country or something almost in a way.
I mean, in a sense, yeah, it's definitely, it's very much a toss-up state in that, most majoritarian politics really don't affect there as much. And so, you know, it's very hard to tell how they're going to come out because it's really just going to depend on the candidates in an election, right? Like, you know, this, like, I think that before Trump, it went to Obama. And then this past election cycle, like, I know a lot of people who voted for Trump specifically on the basis of they could relate to him more. Like, they didn't talk about his policy or whatnot. Like, like the policy wasn't really the consideration because they don't, at the end, they care as much about the policy, right? They care that they were just able to relate to him more because, you know, they aren't really affected by majoritarian politics in the way that people who are marginalized, you know, are to a much greater degree. Or at least that's my hot 2 cents on the subject.
Oh, sure.
Right. You mentioned earlier, like, regarding individuals that can't afford certain things or just don't really want to go through that because it is a very invasive surgery. It's okay when you're younger, but as you get older, these surgeries become a lot more, what's the word?
Well, I mean, the recovery for an older trans person they're not going to bounce back as easily as, say, a 20-year-old. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And it's difficult, but also the fact that if you do transition earlier, these things are the things that we talk about for people that, you know, if they're considering a youth is considering transition, to really weigh doing it earlier, because there is so much to be lost if you wait too long. You know, it's really
that. And I also believe that we need to stop as society being so superficial and so, like, petty and forcing people by saying mean things. I mean, there are people that could be like a viper with their tongue and saying certain things that they're just totally mean. And I don't think that's at all necessary. We need to, like, bring each other up and not focus on, and not just trans people. This is, like, in general, like, women do it to women and men do it to men. And it's like, why are we basing everything on our looks when in reality, you know, we are spirits having a human experience, you know, and it's great to be able to take care of your body and yourself. But when it comes to, you know, like, I don't know if you heard about that trans woman who got beat up pretty badly because of going into a bathroom.
She was early in her transition.
Yeah, early in her transition in Portland. And because she was early in her transition, and obviously you're like in the beginning of your transition, you're still in that awkward stage. You're still, you know, you can't go to the male bathroom because you're now, you know, so it's in that awkward stage. But, you know, people could be so cruel, and literally they beat her up so badly. They broke her jaw. She was hospitalized. And that breaks my heart. You know, when I hear, like, we just had somebody here commented something very rudely that Lena should get FFS. And, you know, it's like, if I could, like, reach over and grab that person by, you know, where I would, and I'm not a violent person, but, you know, last thing a person wants to do is to put things in a trans person's head. And that's very hurtful, extremely hurtful.
And it usually isn't done, but I have, ever since, I don't know if other people go through this, but I transitioned back in 2014 at the age of, well, I was 43 at the time, but it was difficult because I came from a very Christian background, and I worked for a lot of Christian, you know, broadcasting networks and companies and things like that. So I was heavily involved in Christian television, and I accumulated a huge following of haters that have always been after me and tried to tear me down and tell me that I was gonna be living out of a trash heap, and with all of my, you know, friends who were also poor and out of work and everything. And, you know, it just seems to follow me. Here it is, the year 2020, and
we still get the haters.
It still happens. You know,
do you find you get that at all, Riley?
So yeah, a couple of things on this, right? Because I do think about this a lot. So practically speaking, the short answer to your question is yes, right? When I moved to Baltimore, right? You know, like I'm an extrovert by nature. I like talking to people. I seek out relationships with people, and it's hard to do that as a trans person in today's society. So I live in an apartment. I walk to my law school every morning, right? And then I walk home in the evening, and I try to do it before nighttime because, there's a decent amount of crime in the area. But when I moved here originally, I would walk to school, and, some people would see me, and I don't know what they would think, but they would wave at me and like say hi and, invite a response, and I would say hi back. Right. And it was really hard because, early on, like, there were a good couple of times where I got like a slur or two thrown at me, right? And I was worried that people were going to pull a knife. The worst experience I probably ever had. So in Baltimore, something that happens very often, when you're driving around in the city at different stops in the city, there are there are groups of young kids who hang out at stoplights, and they will go up to your car and they'll wipe your windshield. Right. And usually they're doing it because they want a handout. They want some money. And so there was one day where I went up to one of these stoplights. I stopped, and a kid came up to my window. I waved him off. I was telling him, like, no, I don't want that. And he just kind of shrugged, and he wiped it anyway. And he drew like a little heart on there too. And I was like, oh, that's sweet. And then he went up to the side window, and he made a motion to roll down the windshield. And I know in hindsight that I should not have rolled it down. Like, I know what I should have done, but like, I was flattered. He drew a heart. I was like, sure. So I rolled down the window and I said hi. And he went from this expression of like very overjoyed to like to complete disgust. And trigger warning for people who are watching, said, you're a boy, faggot ass bitch, and walked off. And I just kind of sat there for a moment, and I was just kind of processing that before I called my mom and just started crying, right? Because, like, basically where I'm at with it. And this is when I went to law school initially, I wasn't sure like if I was going to go stealth or not, but it seems like the choice was largely robbed from me because I didn't know if my voice was passing, and apparently it wasn't, which just kind of is a condition within my life. And I've been thinking a lot recently about, how that affects me, right? Not having a perfectly passable voice. I've heard some people say it's androgynous. Like, we can talk a lot about the merits of it, but assuming that it's not passable, how do I feel about that? And at the end of the day, really, I don't care that much. And I say that just because it's like the problem as I see it isn't really with me, right? Like, I know I'm a woman, and just about everyone I'm around, especially in the space that I'm in, treats me as that and has never treated me otherwise, right? And so to the extent that they know that I'm trans really doesn't affect me that much. The problem as I see it is, as you've said, more with society, right? Mm-hmm. It has to do with the preconceptions that we put on other people about what is to be expected of and what is normal, quote unquote, with gender expression, right? Like, I do not think, and I will not say that I am like a flawed person or a lesser person just because I have this quality that isn't stereotypically normal, but which otherwise I'm very comfortable with, right? And if people have a problem with that, well then, excuse my French, but yeah, they can fuck right off,
Exactly. And it's also very one-way minded and very small-minded, if that's what I'm trying to use. Women come in all shapes and sizes. Mm-hmm. There's not one perfect looking woman. They don't have, because relatively, when we all start off in our mother's womb, we start off the same. There's a default. So there's very few things that actually alter a man from a woman, depending on the SRY gene. We had a show last week or a couple of days ago that we talked about how backwards people still are when science has evolved, and the truth behind the XX and XY. We had this whole really good show about it, and you can't base on somebody's jawline, because there are a lot of women that have jawlines that are more prominent. There are women that are taller. There are women that have different features from what other women have. So we can't put everybody in a box. And I wish society would get in their thick head and stop trying to compare people to one another, and we as trans people do it to ourselves. We had this battle regarding biology, right? It's like, we don't live based on our biology. Our biology is something we put in the past. We do what we do, and you did what you did so you could live as a woman. We're not going to walk around waving our biology flag. So people try to pick on that all the time. And it's like, what does that solve? I mean, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts regarding when somebody tries to, like, your biology, right?
Well, the thing about that, so there are two things, right? I think that you touched a little bit on this idea that it's really not like, even if you want to resort to like, if you want to make a strict appeal to authority with like, science, right? Or like biological study or whatever, right? If you're making that sort of appeal in your argument, most people who make that argument do it. I mean, like, usually it's in bad faith, right? It's going to almost always be in bad faith. It's not really that you're trying to prove to this person that, logically speaking, they are like, it's not like you're trying to just demonstrate that this person is wrong, right? You're using something that you may have heard in like the 4th grade as a way to try and hurt someone, right? And so when someone is acting out of bad faith, you have to look at whatever they say with strict scrutiny, right? And really, when someone says that, like, all right, so I guess that the statement would be that I'm not like a biological woman, right? Like, that's what people would want to say if they make that argument. And my challenge to that would be to say, in what regard? Like, how do you define a biological woman, right? I mean, like, I've been on HRT. My blood hormonal levels are the same as any biological woman. I've grown breasts like any biological woman. I look like any biological woman. Like, how do you define biology? And then the response to that is usually going to be, well, it's going to depend on your chromosomes. And that, the way that I would respond to that is, well, I mean, gender, like, people haven't known about chromosomes for like the vast majority of human history, right? Like chromosomes haven't been a part of the computation until like, the past like 100 years or so, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you try to define gender according to, some arbitrary thing like that, it seemed like, I understand the appeal of it, right? But it seems very backwards looking in application, right? It's starting from the conclusion that you want to reach as someone who's operating out of bad faith and wants to hurt me or anyone else in a similar position. And you try to gather evidence from there, when in reality, sex and gender are a lot more complicated than people might want to think, right? And I get that, right? Like, people, like, our brains are such construed that we want life to be simple. We want to think that there's only 2 genders and 2 sexes, and that those are mutually, like, those are the same categories, and that they're mutually exclusive, and that there's no in between. Like, that's an easy way to think. And we as humans, we like to make shortcuts. We like to think in shortcuts. It makes life simple for us, but the world just isn't like that, right? And the sooner that people realize it, the better. And honestly, the healthier they'll be in the long run.
Exactly. There was a lot of information that we gleaned from in the last few days about the whole concept of biology and how all of the chromosomes fit into the narrative in this modern era. And it was only agreed upon in 1930s that the XX and XY, male, female, male chromosomes being the XY and the XX being the female. Prior to that, earlier, before the 20th century, there was this understanding of a metabolic theory, and it was totally discarded. It was totally just forgotten for this more important black and white, polarized, with the creation of the artificial synthetic sex hormones of testosterone and the estrogens and things like that. They could nicely package gender into a box that they could sell to people, just like they could sell toys, on at Christmas time to kids, and boys get trucks and girls get dolls, and that whole thing, pink and blue, everything was like put into these nice little categories for people. And for people to say, everybody knows for thousands of years that men are men and women are women. And it's like, no, before the 20th century, everybody understood this, that gender, that sex was on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. It wasn't black or white. It wasn't a female and a male. It was gynandromorphs. It was hermaphrodites. It was a very interesting world that we lived in at that time. And now it just seems like everybody wants this black and white story, you know, and it fits so nicely in a box.
And then we have people like Soldiers of the Cross who just wrote a comment: you can't fix what's wrong between the ears by cutting between the legs.
That's really a stupid, ignorant
exactly
type of a statement. And for you to call yourself a soldier of the cross. Okay, I guess that's what you believe because the Bible tells you certain things in Genesis, or I don't know.
And then says, speaking the truth. Whose truth? Your truth? Your bigoted, small-minded box mentality is not everybody's truth.
What do you say, Riley?
So this is interesting because I sort of wrote, like, again, like you talked about, I wrote my thesis. I specifically conducted research, you know, on what it sounds like this sort of person is. And when I lived in the South, I had a lot of experience around these sort of people, right? And there's a really good book on this subject. It's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Disagree on Religion and Politics. And basically, what it talks about is this idea that, you know, when we talk about things like religion, right? You may have some weird feelings about the title because you might not see these people as good people, but the idea is that not necessarily that every person is objectively a good person, but everyone sees themselves as a good person, right? Like no one looks at themselves and thinks, oh, I'm a bad person, right? Like no one looks at themselves and thinks that, because the ego will not let you, right? As a bottom, like as a baseline rule. And we will try to do whatever we can. The mind will do whatever it can to make sure that we somehow construe the things in our life so that we perceive ourselves as good people. This will affect people in the South in such a way where, you know, they grow up in environments where the gospel is taught to them in a very specific way, right? They are taught the gospel in such a way where certain very traditional values are emphasized more than other ideas which are in the gospel, right? Like, you know, like, for example, if you want to talk about like people who are Christian who support Trump, right? Most people probably would not agree, you know, like most people in that demographic wouldn't agree with the fact that categorically Jesus Christ as portrayed in the Gospels is a socialist, right? Like the things he does, like free, affordable healthcare for everyone, being inclusive to people who are of minority status, like those are socialist ideals. But people who come from the South will not construe it that way because that's not the way they were taught it and not the way that they were brought up learning about it. And so the way that this manifests in discourse is that people who come from this sort of background, if you talk to one of these people and you say, hey, you know, I understand that you believe this about the gospel, about the Bible. Here's another way to look at it that is different from what you think, not necessarily any more or less valid, just different. They don't take that as constructive criticism. They take that as a personal attack, as a personal affront, right? Because you are literally attacking their perfect view of the world, the one which they have grown up with. And so this person in the comments has probably grown up in an area of the world where they've been taught a very, very strict heteronormative, cisnormative version of what gender is. They have been taught that there is no way to change it, and that's what they've grown up to believe. And so we cannot rationally convince them, or it's very hard to rationally convince them that people who are trans are valid in their identities, because to do so challenges their very fundamental understandings of life, right? And so, yeah, it's unfortunate, but really, you know, you shouldn't feel bad about this person in the comments, right? Like whatever they said, like they're going to believe what they believe, and there's no changing their mind. That doesn't mean that they're right in the slightest, right?
Right. And one of the things, I mean, not everyone is a believer. Not everybody has their own. There are Buddhists. There are people that are Hindu. There are people that are agnostic. You know, there are people that were at one point Christians, and their search for truth led them to another path. I mean, I can respect everyone's belief system. I know, we know you're a believer. My wife found you, and we wanted to bring your perspective on how you could actually, what's the word that you used that you were going to ask her? How
reconcile. Well, how do you want me to ask the question? Right, yeah. Well, how is it that you and you're a Christian, right?
I am.
Yeah. okay, how do you reconcile your being trans and also being a Christian?
So there's a couple things, right? I'm hearing some backlash, so I'm going to turn this down just to make sure that there isn't. So first, just on a strict, if you want to just like talk in the most basic interpretive stance, the Bible really doesn't say anything about trans people. There's one passage which maybe you can construe as talking about trans people, and talks about how people of, I think it's like the opposite sex, are forbidden of wearing clothes of the opposite sex. And I mean, that can be construed either way. I'm a woman, so God is saying that I should wear clothing that is affirming of my gender. Boom. Like that's, I mean, like
Right.
as a strict interpretive stance, I feel like it's sort of a moot point, right? But more beyond that, right? Because most people who are anti-trans and Christian usually don't, like if they go there, then it's a very soft argument and it's really shoddy anyway. They usually just make a broader appeal to, you know, God being against like hedonists or like, you know, what, like it's very vague and sort of amalgamous arguments. How I've sort of reconciled, you know, my being trans and Christian, I will admit at first, I'll say at the forefront, and I said this in my other video, I do hold myself out as operating from a place of bias, right? Like that's sort of fundamentally where I operate from. When I was very young, and I realized I was trans and I was very alone, you know, there was not a lot of great ways for me to cope with being trans and being closeted and going through what I was. And, you know, just by pure chance, my mom sort of like, I wasn't raised in a particularly religious household, but my mom sort of gave me a Bible and said, "Yo, nuts." And I did. Right. And I read it, you know, cover to cover, and I got really, you know, really deep into it. And I found myself a God that really cared about me, right? A God that knew me in my mother and knit me together in my mother's womb, a God that would love me no matter what, a God that would, a God that told me to be strong and courageous, to not be afraid nor terrified because of them. For the Lord your God shall go with you. He will never leave nor forsake you. It's my favorite passage, Deuteronomy 31:6. And it was weird because eventually when I went to the South, that was my first mate. Like I'd heard about people who are like, you know, Baptist and like fundamentalist Christian and all that. I'd heard about the Westboro Baptist Church. That was my first exposure to them. And so that was sort of what was the start of my thesis, right? Like exploring, like, how could I, as someone who has read the Bible, you know, come to such a different conclusion from other people who got something very different from the Bible? And,
Right.
you know, part of that is that, like, obviously I'm partially motivated in the fact that I'm trans and I want to believe that God loves me, because the alternative is that God doesn't love me and that, you know, my entire existence is sort of a moot point. But I want to believe, and this is sort of where faith comes in, that God is not a hateful God that just created me, you know, in such a state of existence where I was doomed to suffer, right? It's not like God created me trans just for the purpose of hating me, because I knew that I know that this is an intrinsic quality of mine, right? A lot of people paint being trans as a choice, and I'm just going to say blanketly, it's not. This is just who I am. And so operating from that, God created me this way, and so God must love me. And that's sort of where I operate from as a Christian, right? And I've always sort of gone through life with this idea that God has walked with me, and I've lived a pretty good life so far. So, hey, if it works, it works.
Yeah, and it works for you. I mean, Lena was raised in a very Christian household.
Fundamental Pentecostal.
Yeah.
I worked with the Southern Baptist Convention, worked with the Baptist Sunday School Board. I mean, I sat and heard every preacher that you would ever have heard on TV. Rod Parsley, Paul and Jan Crouch. I worked for TBN. I mean, I know all the ins and outs. Benny Hinn, Jimmy Swaggart. I went to Bible college. I mean, I was drenched in my Christianity, and the fundamentalist version of it too, the Pentecostal knock you out under the power, slain in the spirit, speaking in tongues, and all of that, you know. And I really just have absolutely nothing to glean from what I was taught. You know, evidence of whatever it was that was being instilled into me, which was to love God, you know, and to love others, was never demonstrated to me in any tangible, palpable sense. So everything that has happened throughout, you know, my transition has really just taken me on this journey of just not really believing at all, because it's just, it doesn't serve me any purpose. It's only been a detriment. So I honor your walk and what you're doing and how you're reconciling what you believe and everything. But as for me, I have discovered so many other things that I just have no, you know, interest in the other.
And I, during the time that Lynn and I got together, we really searched a lot and did a lot of reading and saw a lot of contradiction in the Bible, saw how God's children behave towards individuals in the LGBT community. And I said to myself, I don't want any part of this. This is what God has to offer. I don't want any part. So, you know, I became from agnostic pretty much to an atheist. And again, I respect your walk and I respect the walk of everyone, because we're all entitled to walk on a journey system. But when you get people in that room that turned around and said, created in God's image, male and female, our sexuality is a gift from God, back in love to him, transgenderism, violence. God doesn't make mistakes. You three, like these whole.
You actually cut out a little bit, so I didn't hear all that, but I feel like I didn't want to hear all that.
They said, created in God's image and likeness, male and female, our sexuality is a gift from God that we offer back in love to him. Transgenderism violates God's design. And then they go, God doesn't make mistakes. You three need to get right with Jesus.
Well, actually, all right. So this is an interesting argument. And again, like, I don't want to get bogged down in like textualist interpretations of the Bible, because like people can go back and forth about this forever. And like, you're not going to change any minds. But this is a neat little Genesis argument. And I actually heard someone make a really cool response to it, right? So it talks about in Genesis how God created men and women and created them equal and yada, yada. Eve from Adam's rib, which also technically means that Eve has XY chromosomes. Eve is the first trans woman, just saying. But what I think is a little more interesting of a take from Genesis, if we want to go down this rabbit hole. I'm sorry, I'm losing breath. There's a lot of passages that talk about in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created the land and the sea. God created man and woman. Well, the thing is, God created day and night. Well, there's clearly dusk. There's clearly dawn. There are things in between night and day. And land and sea. Well, there are clearly inlets. There are clearly streams. There are clearly lakes. There are clearly in-betweens in that. There's the earth and the star, or God created the heavens and the earth. All right, well, there are things in between that too. Like there are in-betweens in all of the bimodal categories that are talked about in Genesis. And sex and gender really isn't exclusive to that list, right? And what's interesting, the reason, and the person who I heard make this was in a sermon that I listened to at a really progressive sort of faith festival that I go to every year. You know, the interesting thing was that is that they talked about how in all of these in-between spaces, those are some of the most beautiful, right? Those are places where the most beautiful things in God's creation, if you believe in God and you believe that everything is God's creation, like those in-between spaces are where some of the most meaningful beauty is found. And I think that's true for trans and queer people as well. So, yeah, I would fundamentally disagree with the person who commented to that effect. If they want to strictly rely on the text, it doesn't support what they're saying.
Exactly. We've like gone deep into the rabbit hole. And there's a book that, what's the name of it that you read about Jehovah?
Oh, well, I mean, it's just, okay, we have, and this is my own journey with Christianity and how it fits into my world, right? And basically reading a scripture like, say, Jeremiah, I think it was, oh God. Oh, it's Isaiah 47:5, is it? 45:7. It says, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, the one who creates evil and creates good. I mean, it's almost like there's this duality to the God of the world created, and that this being not only creates the good but also creates the evil. So it just really, it's confusing to me, because growing up, like I said, I went to Christian school, Christian college, and graduated and everything. I was going to be a youth music minister and blah 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 and all that stuff. So I was really into learning and wanting to know more. And when I realized that what the God of the Old Testament doesn't really sound like the Jesus of the New Testament, and is really very segregational in his classification of who's his and who's not, and who should be destroyed and who should stay. And he's vengeful and wrathful and jealous and angry, and he creates all these, like the angel of death, he tells it to come and destroy the Egyptians. I mean, it's like this really crazy duality of like, I'm the God and I'm also the devil. It seems like,
to me,
in my estimation,
what I took on and all the rabbit holes that I went into is that the God of this world is actually like an Anunnaki or another species that came here and took over. And I know exactly, of if there is no higher energy that created everything. I'm sure there is, but I don't think the God of the Bible, in my opinion, is the true God. And I think it's like some sort of divisive force that came here to destroy the original creation. That's why there's several creations in Genesis. And there's like, if you go deep into the rabbit hole and really uncover a lot of rocks, we can really get deeper into the little simpleton stories that they try to tell us from the Bible. And then you have people that use the Bible as a sword to hurt people,
Yeah.
But,
So I mean, there's a couple things to say on that, I appreciate that sentiment, right? To give a couple specific classifications, like historically, I've been more associated with the Episcopal Church, as far as my own religious denomination, but nowadays I'm leaning much more in practice towards the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is, embodies this idea that yes, the gospel and the Bible is a very good learning tool, but there is truth, to the extent of exploring what creation is and what God is in most religious texts and, most aspects of life, right? And so I always welcome, exploring those alternative ideas about what faith is and what God is and what God means, right? And so, yeah, like I feel like your ideas are completely valid in that regard. Talking about these people who use this as a sword, there's actually a very interesting model of psychological development. It's called the spiral dynamics model. There's like a lecture series on YouTube, and it talks about, especially in the context of religion, it talks about religion in mainly two different ways, right? And you could actually kind of split the Bible into and sort of look at the Old and New Testament in sort of these different ways, right? And what you see in very early forms, very primal forms of psychological development is this idea of religion enforced by guilt, right? And religion, enforceable as a means to structure society. But how do you structure society at a point where society doesn't really exist? Well, you make people guilty by not following it or not following its doctrine strictly, right? That's where you get people who are hateful towards like people of minority status, especially LGBT people, because they don't really know. Like the doctrine doesn't say why these people are bad, right? Like, in I think it's Leviticus that has like the abomination man with another man and all that, right? It doesn't say why that's bad. It just says that it's bad and people follow it. Why? Because they should, because that's what the doctrine says, right? And it instills guilt in them to not follow it, right? That's sort of the whole motivation behind following that old scripture. But what you see eventually, like what you see in later stages of psychological development, is a shift. Like usually what you see actually is people shifting away from faith entirely. People realize that faith is actually, in a lot of ways pretty bad. It's pretty bad towards people in minority status, and people end up, kicking it to the curb. Like a lot of LGBT people and like the sort of the experience that you've talked about, right? Like people see the limitations of faith as a mean, you know, especially in terms of how it treats people minority status or people who don't fit within the strict confines of its pre-made hierarchy, whatever it is. Eventually, in later stages of the model, you see religion make sort of a comeback for people who want to explore it, but it takes on a much different sort of look, right? It takes on religion as a means to further relationships with each other, right? It becomes less, you know, like a strict doctrine that you have to follow or else you'll be punished, you know, by divine smiting or being sent to hell or whatever. And it focuses more on having compassion for each other and looking out for each other and, you know, going out of your way to help those who are in lesser conditions of life than your own, right? And you see this parallel between the Old Gospel or the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? The Old Testament is follow these rules or I will smite and punish you, versus Jesus is like, hey, everyone love each other, help people who are less fortunate, be chill, right? It's very different ways of construing that. And I just feel like it's a very interesting way to look at the gospel, but especially nowadays, looking at more conservative versus like liberal progressive, like especially Christianity, right? You have people who are much more conservative because there's a lot more people who are in lower stages of psychological development, especially down in the Bible Belt South, because that's the sort of area of the US which is more made to be conducive to that. The hardest way to sort of get out of this mentality is to realize the limitations of your religion or whatever faith you follow that has these strict doctrines. It's very hard to do that when you grow up in a society where you're taught that any questioning of that pre-made structure is going to get you condemned, right? Think of the devil who was condemned for questioning God, right? But then, you know, over in the Northeast or like the churches I go to, you see less of a focus on following the scripture strictly and more on focus on, hey, we're going to use Jesus as a way to get closer to one another and to help people. Sorry, that was a bit of a...
No, that's good.
That's
good. No, I just, you know, but then how do you reconcile where Jesus says, I don't come to bring peace, but a sword? You know, it's like, I mean, the Jesus, you know, the Jesus that seems to be such a peacemaker and such a wonderful little story about the baby and, you know, how he said, you know, turn the other cheek and the Beatitudes and, you know, the first shall be last and, you know, do unto others as you would, you know, all these things, right? And the fact is, though, that I feel that there are certain innate things that I don't really need to ask Jesus to help me with, because I just, you know, all these people that would be hating on me tonight on this comment section, if they were hurt on the side of the street and I could help them, I would. But it's not because Jesus told me to. It's because I am innately a good person inside. And that innateness doesn't stem from, like, I don't feel like it stems from some godlike source outside of me, but within me, that sense of love that created me is that which impels me to do good for people.
And what I find is these people that are following the gospel or following the Bible or following God, the majority of them, I don't want to say all of them, but the majority of them are very hateful. They're very divisive. You know, they're very prejudiced towards other people. They're very cohesive between themselves. Like when I was going to church and I detransitioned and they're all like, oh, lovey-dovey. As soon as I got back with Lena and I returned to me, it was like
the spears came out.
The spears came out. I'm like,
started flying.
It's like, so it's very conditional. There's not an unconditional love. And to me, that if that's the God they follow,
where's the agape that they talk about?
Nothing to do with that God.
Yeah.
I believe we are creator gods ourselves. I believe that we're here on this planet in these forms to learn and grow and evolve. And I believe that this God of the Bible, that I believe is both Satan and God at the same time and deceiving us, doesn't want us to evolve, wants to keep us down here and wants to keep us at a lower level. Him up here, worship, and us down here, slaves.
And one other thing that I was going to say was, you know, the story, the account of the Tower of Babel, I'm sure you know it very well, in Genesis, where it talks about the God, you know, of creation saying, let us go down and confuse their language, because if we don't these people have become so powerful that if we don't do something, that they may become
like us.
That who knows what they'll be able to do. So that right there tells me that we have a untapped potential as creator beings that we are ourselves, that we have that spark of divinity within ourselves, that we have the ability to do what the divine is said to only be able to do. And we just haven't realized that potential. Not that we're gods in the sense of like, a pride sense, but we come from a lineage that is divine, and we are being suppressed to not know that lineage. And I think that the Bible and the tools that are used to confuse people's language and to adhere to a certain doctrinal belief or standpoint, which is the basis of all Christianity and Catholicism, is this way of controlling the masses to make them subservient to this greater word or understanding of trying to live a life like Jesus did, or be an example or be sheep, and I really think that we've been limited. I think we've been shut down personally.
So a couple points on that. The first is that I definitely don't want to imply or I definitely don't want to devalue your experience, right? Like that's not at all what I'm attempting to do or say. Like so Faith, the person who I lived with before, I talked about her earlier. When I lived with her, we actually had this discussion a lot because she was somewhere between agnostic and atheist, basically was just on the verge of going atheist, right? And so we had a lot of these sort of discussions about religion. And, when I was first talking to her, it was a bit of an adjustment when I mentioned I was Christian, right? And, and she came from a very similar experience, right? Like conservative Southern Baptist household, very unaccepting as to, why when she came out, she wasn't accepted by her family, right? Like there's I definitely understand that experience and I don't want to devalue it. And if Christianity has had such a negative experience on you that you don't want to be associated with it, then yeah, I don't want, that's totally valid. And I don't want to take that away. Right. I just, this is why I say from earlier that, fundamentally, I said this at the beginning, I am working from a place of bias, right? In that I have fundamentally throughout my life relied on the God that I have come to know, that helped me through, these early parts of my life, which were hard for me and which I can't really certifiably say I would have gotten through in one piece without, right? And so I do operate from this fundamental spot of there is a God, and that God, whatever form they encapsulate or whatever gender, whatever they are, that they love me, right? That's fundamentally where I'm operating from. And so that's going to, derive very different conclusions, it sounds like, from where you're coming from, and that you come from a place where you don't have that kind of an experience. And so that makes sense, right? I would challenge the idea that what the larger church does is accurately reflective of what actually is said in the Bible, particularly in the Gospels, right? Historically, what you see the church do has been very, very contradictory to what Jesus actually says, right? The church, the most basic example is the Crusades, right? The church used the Crusades conducted the Crusades with the justification that they were retaking the Holy Land, when in practicality they were gaining political power, right? That's what happened during the time. It was at such a point in their life where they realized they had an opportunity and they were able to regain political power over in the Middle East. And so they took it, right? And it's not like they did what Jesus said, because, Jesus very fundamentally says do not don't kill. I'm not even sure if Jesus says that, but it's pretty explicitly implied, don't kill other people. If you want to use a specific example, the woman who was set to be stoned, right? The prostitute or whatever in the street, right? Who everyone was supposed to kill based on the law of the Old Testament, in which Jesus went up to and said, no, he who is without sin, throw the first stone, right? And that's actually an explicit instance where Jesus goes against the old law, because the law in the Old Testament says that it is mandated to kill someone in that place, right? There's actually a lot of instances in the gospel where Jesus explicitly sort of rejects, the laws of the Old Testament, and explicitly goes out of his way to say and clarify, like, listen, what's most important is that you love your neighbor as you do yourself, right? That is what's most important. And so, you don't really, at least in my hot take, is that you don't really see that in a lot of churches nowadays. You see church being used as a means to, like, you see large churches, especially Baptist churches and the Catholic Church, to the extent that they're still relevant. They're falling by the wayside more and more every day. But you see them using the gospel and using Christianity as a means to facilitate hate, right? As a means to oppress others, as a means to push other people down so you can raise yourself up. And I would say that Jesus, if he were alive today, would be appalled by that.
Yeah. And how do you, we've done a lot of research and dug deep in finding the fact that they say that there is no historical records at all that claim that Jesus was ever born, that Constantine was pretty much the one that kind of created the story and the storyline. There's just a lot of stuff that just doesn't really match at all. I mean, they can't even really say the day Jesus was born. They said it was December, but it couldn't have been. There's just like so many different things that just really doesn't make sense. And then there's a lot of other Jesus-like characters throughout history, mythology, that have the same born of a virgin. If you watch the movie Zeitgeist, that have like 10 or 11 different mythological, characters that portray the same thing with Jesus. So, and again, I'm not here to convince you. I mean, I think it's beautiful that you have those beliefs, and it's brought you where you are today. Yeah. I feel that I am where I am today for my spirituality, the ability of knowing that there is a higher self, a higher me in another dimension that guides me and protects me. And, that I'm able to do great things. Like even the Jesus character says, why do you marvel at what I do? You too will do greater things than I. The kingdom of heaven is within you. What is the kingdom of heaven? What is heaven? Heaven is, to me, is like something inward that we're always searching outside, but everything that we need is inside of us. Mm-hmm. And whether we want to call it Allah, Buddha, God, Jehovah, whatever it is, it really stems within us. And again, I'm not trying to convince you. I respect you and I respect your belief. I think it's wonderful that you are where you are and then you're able to allow that to get you to where you are today. And I respect that you're not, pushing things down people's throats. And this is what a lot of these individuals try to do, and it's a put off for a lot of people.
Had a question from Marcy Mark that, Riley, I was just about to write that exact statement. They don't follow Jesus' teachings or a simple command to just love one another. The Bible's been used to control and oppress by kings and authority.
Yeah. So what I might say, you made a comment earlier, about whether or not Jesus, was actually a real person and, the implications of that. And I might want to push on that a little bit. My inner, I don't want to say philosopher because I don't want to make myself out to be any sort of expert, but I want to push on that subject because, I've wondered about that, right? At the end of the day, what does it matter whether or not Jesus was or was not a real person? And I'll answer this question, right? Because I've thought a lot about it. Lena, you mentioned earlier this idea that if you saw someone on the road who was abhorrent and, they may have believed terrible things about you, but you saw that they were injured, that you would help them, right? And not because Jesus tells you to, but because it's the right thing to do. That's what your moral compass points you to do. And so I like that idea because I know that there are a lot of people who use religion as sort of their sole moral compass, but not because it's not like they do those things because they believe it's the right thing to do. They do those things because it's what the gospel says to. The problem with that being that implies if the gospel didn't say, to help others, or if it didn't say to be a nice person, then those people would probably be as mean as they want without any consequence, at least, inflicted on themselves, right? And I would like to think that this is something that Jesus was trying to get away from, right? At least in the ideas that, he is recounted to have preached, right? It's not so much that you should do what is said to do in the gospel because it's what he says to, right? It's not like he's making an appeal to authority. It's not just like, do this because I say to. Like, he goes out of his way in the stories and the sermons to try and convince you on the merits of his arguments, right? He doesn't say, I am right because he's not saying, I am right because I say so. He says, I am right, and here are the reasons why. And so really, whether or not you believe he was a real person, whether or not you're Christian, there is still credibility to his ideas, right? And so, when you ask, like, when you're talking about whether or not Jesus is a real person or not, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because it's not going to change how I live my life. I still abide by the rules that he suggests in the gospel and by, the teachings that he has in there, not because it's just what he says to do, but because I do genuinely believe that they are morally right things to do, right? There's a distinction there, right? I'm just trying to sort of tease that out is what I'm saying.
No, I totally understand where you're coming from, but I wouldn't ascribe at this point in my life those things to just Jesus, because I think Jesus is given the credit for it. But yet there are certainly many instances that, and that's the thing, that we in the Western world and this Western civilization, we do not open ourselves up to the writings of other ancient cultures and stuff. And some old writings in the old, like, Sumerian, Eastern religions and stuff like that, Buddhism and things like that, are very, very, very similar to, the teachings of the Buddha. Some of those things that were predating Jesus even made their way into the Bible somehow and attributed to Jesus. Right. But the thing is, they originally came from a different place. And that's the thing, Jesus, and I think the Roman Empire had a plan to use the Jesus story, to use the Jesus narrative, and to construct their little world around it. And this is why we have what we have today. We have this westernized civilization that has run rampant in the name of Christianity. The conquistadors took away from the native population, stole their riches, stole their history, stole their culture, stole their sense of identity, and the people died.
Books were burned.
Yeah. People were put to death. Any alternative, and they call it occult. And occult really just means things that are hidden. Those things were hidden away and taken and put in a place where nobody could find them. And see, that's where I'm at, because I was taught all this stuff about the Bible and, but mom, but dad, what about this? Well, the Bible doesn't say that, so it must not be true. What about this? What about that? And now, after, investigating on my own and finding out that there are other things out there that have been hidden from me, I really can't reconcile this whole concept of Christianity and the basis, because I was very much adherent to the Christian faith. I wanted to believe. I thought that maybe, this couldn't possibly, if trans was wrong, if being who I was wrong, then was I really going to hell? And it was like this torture chamber of like back and forths and stuff like that. And then I realized, I also recall, feeling like, oh, well, the Lord told me, Jesus confirmed to me that he loved me and that he would never leave me or forsake me and all this stuff. And it was all wonderful, and it fed me and it kept me going. But at the end of the day, I'm like, well, okay, well, that's not holding, and that's not holding. And before you know it, you're holding on to like a bunch of sand that's just going through your fingers. And you're like, well, then what's real? Oh, it's that I love because I am a loving person, not because Jesus compels me to love,
Because before Jesus, there have been many Jesus-like avatars and characters. And ultimately, I believe it's just our inner good. And we battle with that inner good and inner bad. It's like the devil and the angel. I think there's the duality that we live here on this planet, that we're here to learn to evolve and unite with one another and become one again. It's a consciousness that we're tapping into, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, so Lena, like, I totally believe that, like, everything that you just said is valid, right? Like, I love that, right? Like, that shows that you have a very deep level of self-reflection, and that you have a degree of thought about, and both of you, I don't mean to just, talk about Lena, Mark, you as well, of course, but, it's really good because most people who are Christian, especially like conservative Christians, do not give that degree of thought to any aspect of their religious life, right? Like they believe what they believe because it's what they're told to believe, right? And there's really not a lot of room for spiritual growth at all. Now, do I believe that spiritual growth has to be, like one strict little, I guess, Christian path? No. Right? Spiritual growth can take on, any sort of path, right? Mark, you're talking about this idea of consciousness and connectedness with other people. Like that is a wonderful and really interesting, path of spiritual development. And Lena, like yours is, laden with a lot of hardships, and I sympathize with that, right? But that's also just like, these are very different paths of spiritual development. I don't think that any one of them is more valid than the other, right? Because, the more that you read on literature, on scripture, on how other religions, their take on the world and their morals, then it's only going to help you in your development, right? Like, it's not like if you are, like for me, right? It's not like if I read, something written by like Hindu, I don't know what their scholars, what their cartographers are named, but like, like, if I read Hindu texts, it's not like it's going to make me any worse of a Christian. I mean, like some people might say that, but it's not as if I'm operating under this sort of bad faith mentality of, oh, I'm doing this because I just hate my faith. And like, I don't even know how you construe it, right? Like I legitimately want to know more about how other faiths have evolved and to see if I can, to borrow language from someone who I used to live with, I want to see if I can see the face of God in other scriptures and other faiths and other religions, right? Like I want to have that exploration and that experience. And if at the end of that journey, I end up back at, my little old Christian beginnings, then awesome. And if I end up somewhere else, then, all the better, because it means I will have taken a very long and very interesting journey of self-exploration, right? And so talking about, some of these people, especially who have commented, who, are not, who sound very hateful and very limited in their understanding of the world, then it's. I'm sorry, I'm reading this comment.
I put it there so I won't forget to mention it.
Right.
All right, but yeah, it's like so the people who we've talked about who have commented, I feel a little bad for them, honestly. I kind of pity them in the sense that it sounds like they've lived a very spiritually limited lifestyle, right? It sounds like they haven't really opened up the possibility to explore other perspectives. Even if like, I can even like toss them a bone. Like you don't have to, end up believing whatever you read from other scriptures or other religions. Like just being able to open yourself up to that exploration so you can understand other people. Like, for example, being able to read Islamic texts, because God knows no one in our country does, even though it's constantly a political issue. Right. Like I feel like that would at least pave the way for a lot of greater understanding of other people in the world, and would also be able to open up more spiritual development, on an individual level.
Right. And for instance, this David G. Pasteur says our Slavic god is called Svarog, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's the god of fire, creator of everything. People believed in him before Christian priests came to our land. And what ends up happening is the Christian crusades literally killed people, forced people to believe in this new god, because Christianity is relatively very new compared to other religions and other beliefs. So it's like they're the new kids on the block, but they're the bullies, and they've come in and destroyed cultures and destroyed other people's belief system that they believed from generation to generation before Christ was even an idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's interesting, because I think I wanted to kind of branch off into this topic where we discuss the meaning of of why we did what we did. I really do believe that trans identity and transitioning is literally a spiritual endeavor. It is something that we innately choose to do because we are wanting to grow as the beings that we are on this planet, and we want to develop, and we want to ask those questions, and we want to reshape ourselves and reform ourselves in the form that we see ourselves to be. And I don't know what you think about that.
I wanted to add something before you say something. I think originally we were one. We were both male and female in one body. And this Elohims, these gods that came from another dimension or whatever, literally divided us. And our search for our other half is what leads us to do what we're doing. That's why I think it's very spiritual.
I've heard of that idea. I think there's references of that idea in like ancient Greek philosophy. So it's interesting, and I don't have much to add other than this hot take on, I've thought a lot about about scripture, right? The most paramount rule that Jesus talks about in the gospel is to love your neighbor as you do yourself. People usually remember the love your neighbor part, but usually forget the latter. In order to follow this most important rule, you do need to fundamentally love yourself, right? You do need to care about yourself as much as you care about the people around you. And so if you are trans and you are in a place where you're fundamentally unable to love the self because you're at such a place where you just can't love your body, or you need to change something so that you can better, relate to society and live your life, then it sounds like that scripture is advocating for you to follow that desire, so that you can start loving yourself and therefore love others to your best capacity. Right. So to that extent, yeah, I completely agree that it is a very spiritual experience. It's led to a lot of very deep spiritual growth for me, certainly much more than if I had not transitioned. Right. And I consider myself holistically a much better person now than I was before.
And I totally agree, because, my past conditioning and indoctrination had not left me very open to the options that that would allow me to be compassionate to all kinds of people. In society, given the totem pole of where we sit on the societal spectrum, there's the alpha male, obviously, and then there's the trans woman, and that in a male gendered world that way, that is just kind of, it's humble pie for me, because I know that if I do pass and people don't think anything, then it's all wonderful and great. But the moment that someone knows anything different, it's like, society still has that, especially the older generation, there's that real loss of respect for a person. They're like, oh my gosh, you're like one of those people, I mean, so I don't know.
And that's based a lot on this whole religious dogma, that they made man be so important and then women less than. But if you're a man that is like stepping down and wanting to become a woman, hell, yeah, everything goes.
You just lost everything.
It's like, instead of looking at people's spirit, because I believe we're spirit first, and these meat suits are just an accessory. It's like putting on a costume. And we try to like match what we have inside, our sense of who we are, of our spirit, with our meat suit. But people shouldn't be judging us by our meat suit, and it shouldn't be as we shouldn't be ridiculed. We shouldn't be, made feel the way that we are made feel because we decide to do this. And I believe this is extremely spiritual, more than most people ever care to know.
And I think the natives understood this process a lot better. And again, this is what is lost to Christians, to our westernized civilization, is the need for transition to happen in certain people's lives, and for things to be changed, and for people to be open to change and stuff like that. And no, not everybody obviously is gonna, I'm not saying everybody should be transitioning, obviously no, but what I'm saying is that there are certain groups of people there are certain segments of people that do this for a purpose, and the native populations recognized it, and they honored it, and they respected it, and they even looked up to those of us that did, you know, as the mediators, as the ones with the wisdom, as the shamans, as, you know. So I just think it's really sad in this day and culture that we live in. And I don't want to give Christianity all of the blame, but I do want to say, why, Christianity, did you do this? Because Roman Catholicism and all the people that, you know, all the conquerors that conquered in the name of Jesus and God, and planting their flag and saying that these people, you know, need to be brought into the belief system from the native, you know, here on this continent down into South America, and you know, I mean, so I just really do think that it's a real disservice. And if Christianity has left a legacy, it's the legacy of death and destruction, you know, because they're still destroying people. A lot of Christians are still trying to destroy people from the inside. Like, they come and attack us here on our channel. They, you know, they tell us that we're wrong when we know innately that we're not wrong, but they have a different system. And like you said, you can't really change their mind because it's etched in stone by conditioning.
Right. And so a couple things. I do agree to the extent that, like, I don't think it's all Christianity, right? And I'm not devaluing your argument. I'll come back to in a second. But like, so earlier I talked about like when I walk to school in the morning, right? And I'm scared to talk to people because of my experiences, right? It's not like when people talk to me, they always say the greatest things. I get catcalls, and like people treat me very demeaningly because we still live in a largely patriarchal society, as much as some people who are anti-feminist might want to say that we don't, right? Like, that is just a condition of our being. Now, going back to, and then, you know, if I open my mouth and people clock me, then, you know, they treat me even worse than they would have if they thought I was just a cis woman, right? So there definitely is like a hierarchy in that regard. But like, you know, even cis women are still seen as lesser than men nowadays, at least on a larger aggregate societal scale. Now, back to this idea of, is it caused by Christianity? I think there's probably a strong case that, you know, a lot of it is, right? A lot of our early formative years in America, like we had a lot of very strong Christian roots. And so, you know, that's sort of like throughout much of our early development as a nation, at least if we're just looking at America, had a very strong Christian history. And so, you know, Christianity, especially the Old Testament, has very strong themes of patriarchy, right? Like just all throughout the Old Testament, and even a little bit in the New Testament, you know, just with Jesus constantly looking up to his Father. But there's a lot of discussion in that. And yeah, that could have an effect on it. The legacy that Christianity has to leave today, unfortunately, I do agree that largely it's negative, right? We are at a place in society where most young people do not associate with Christianity because they recognize those problems, right? Most young people, especially younger, more knowledgeable, like say college age or you know, very around that age, people recognize the problems with Christianity that we've been discussing, right? Like, people are wise enough to, you know, we have the internet, we can see like what the Westboro Baptist Church does, right? Like, everyone knows about them. Does that mean that that's the full legacy of what they've done? I would like to not think so. It's unfortunate that right now we live in a society where the people who are heard are not necessarily the people who are right, but the people who scream the loudest, right? And so I would say, just from personal experience, that there are plenty of Christians who do follow and preach a really good message, right? When I was down in Memphis and I lived at this intentional community, that was a point in my life where I was at my most vulnerable. I wasn't out to my family. I thought that they were going to just straight up reject me. I didn't really have that much money to my name after I graduated from undergrad, and I didn't know where to go because I was in the middle of transition. And I happened to be able to find, by fortunate circumstance of just, looking around and finding churches when I was conducting my research, I've happened to find a church in the community that was very welcoming of me, right? Now, are they going to be as well known as the Westboro Baptist Church? No, because they do largely good work. And unfortunately, good work doesn't really get reported that much, in the larger society. What gets reported are things which are more outrageous, which invoke more reaction, right? This is the whole problem with Twitter and cancel culture, right? That, people who are right are not usually the ones who are retweeted the most. The people who are retweeted are the ones who say the most outrageous and most reactionary kind of things. And so I think it's a little redundant, or not redundant, a little dismissive to say that the entire legacy of Christianity is negative. I do agree that a substantial part of it certainly is, right? Especially in terms of effect, right? Like Christianity has had a very negative aggregate effect on tons and tons of people. Does that mean that all of it has been bad? No, because I mean, from at least my own personal experience, some of it has been so good that it has even gotten me through some of the most important parts of my life and some of the most critical points of my life. And, I think that a large part of that goes back to, again, this idea that most people, like, you see two different kinds of Christianity in America, right? You see Christianity being enforced by guilt on one hand, which is definitely the majority take on it. And on the other hand, you see Christianity as a means to facilitate and deepen relationships with one another, which is more my experience.
Wow, we have really tackled a lot of issues here, and we didn't really get to, some of the questions that we had for you that were more of a personal nature, but you have a really great mind, and we really appreciate you taking the time to, to hash out some of these things, and love to have you on again sometime, because, we could talk about even more, I'm sure.
What do you think about the reaction of people in the Super Bowl halftime show that they did?
To be honest, I was working on a paper when the Super Bowl was happening. I'm just hearing a little bit about it. Tell me the facts, and I'll give you my basic reaction.
Well, Christians are really in uproar. I mean, they always get uproar for whatever kind of halftime show they do. But there was Shakira and Jennifer Lopez, and they did I think a marvelous performance. Very good-looking women in their one's 50, the other was in late 43. And, it was very beautiful, done in my home state, Miami. And, people were claiming that it was like this nudity show and children shouldn't be watching this. And, it was just like, it's almost like it was a very empowering show because of women. It was like all little girls singing along with Jennifer Lopez and stuff like that. It's like,
there was a message that they were trying to communicate, and talking about, just that, that this country is just a huge melting pot of all different kinds of cultures, and basically the Latin American culture in this country has really contributed a lot, and is going to be a big block of the voting party, the vote, this coming election and everything, more than ever before. But this culture that Mark and I come from, he's Cuban, I'm Puerto Rican, is very expressive. And yes, they're sexual in their appeal of how they move and how they dance and how they celebrate, and they have a very strong sense of being, and celebration of life and everything. But it's almost like people just don't like different cultures expressing themselves, and then they mistake these things as being just simply sensuality for sensuality's sake. It really is unfortunate in this day and age. Franklin Graham had to retweet something, and had to tweet something and talk about how, American culture, the NFL should be ashamed of themselves because they allow this to show women derogatorily and blah, 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 blah. But, turning a blind eye to pornography in the church, to molestation that happens and abuse in the church, to the sexualizing of women in the church, and just this patriarchal type society that they keep wanting to invoke on the rest of the world. And it's really sad, because here we have these two women who work really hard to do an incredible job,
Yeah,
get themselves into the best physical shape to be able to do it at 43 and 50. And I think some people are just jealous, because or some of these wives don't want their husbands to see women moving like that, and for them to be interested, because they're not really doing anything to make themselves look better. You know what I mean? It's almost like jealousy in a way. I don't know.
Yeah. So this kind of actually sounds like it relates a lot back earlier to this idea of Christianity being enforced by guilt, right? So what you see here from the sounds of it is you have a lot of people who got really upset that there are some people in not as many clothes as the average person, and you could see a little skin, and they got all uppity because, they're like, oh, well, the Bible says that you need to clothe yourself and you need to be a chaste maiden and all this, that, and the other, right? And really, it's just that people feel guilty that, that there's this idea, they might, usually what happens, the mental gymnastics people go through, people want to be able to do that. People want to be able to go out and do that. People want to enjoy their bodies. People want to be able to explore themselves, to feel sexy and all that good stuff, right? That's fun. Problem, there's a lot of doctrine in the Bible that tells you that you should feel bad about that. That's temptation. That is sinful. You should not do it because God says so. But at the end of the day, really, what you have then is that people who feel like they can't do this thing that they want to, but are prohibited because they feel guilty. And so they develop this mentality of, okay, well, if I can't do it, well, then I'm going to call out every single other person who does it, and I'm going to make them feel just as guilty as me. Right. And it's kind of awful, because that's how you can, as I mentioned earlier, right? None of these people think of themselves as bad people, right? They see themselves as legitimately good people, but these are the sort of mental gymnastics that you have to jump through in order to be able to do something, to say things which are easily perceived and which are objectively hateful, but to be able to think to yourself, I'm doing a good thing, because they should feel guilty about themselves. According to my worldview, they should feel guilty because I feel guilty about it, right? And it's unfortunate, because it means that everyone needs it. The ultimate end game of that mentality is everyone should feel guilty about wanting to explore their body, which kind of sucks, because then life would be really boring.
They would. We're animals. People they want to put us in a category of some sort of special snowflake. We're mammals.
Yeah.
We act on reflexive nature. We're sexual beings. We get excited when we see things, and we're supposed to be if this creator created us to have certain reflexes, that's a bad joke that he played on us. So
right.
you see something you like, you get aroused, you're bad. It was well, I'm sorry, then you shouldn't have created this thing that you created in
exactly.
me. It's
caveat, I will also always say, follow the urges of your body to an extent, right? Rape is bad, always. Right. Do not do that. And don't do there's always a reasonableness standard, right? Now you want to be careful with reasonableness, because it is based on expectations of larger society, right? But if you want to, if your idea of exploring your body is walking around butt ass naked, then unless you're at a nudist beach or something where that is objectively reasonable, don't do that, right?
But we've made nudity into something that's ugly or bad. But other countries, it's very normal. It's only the United States that we're living this type of the prudish life.
Song of Solomon is pretty graphic. I remember reading it when I was 8
Oh yeah.
old. I was like, Mom, what about this? And she's like, oh my gosh, don't read that.
Yeah, this is a fun bit of history. So the Song of Solomon, actually, so back in the day when it was taught to young Jewish boys, they would actually make sure to not teach that to young Jewish men until they reached an age of maturity, 18-year-olds or 18 or so, because they didn't want them to be using it as pornography. Right. That's what young guys had access to.
But, there's nothing wrong with sex as long as it's between two consenting adults.
Yeah.
Our human body is very beautiful. A body is in nice shape it's art. It's beautiful. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And as long as it's between two consenting adults and there's like movement and dance, there's absolutely nothing wrong with dancing. And they're like, there's nothing wrong with showing a little skin. I mean, we are born naked, it's like, we make it so dirty, and it's like, what's wrong with their minds?
No, I mean, it's like, if you have a body that is attractive and you've done a lot of work to get to that, because you can't just have great abs and a great booty and great arms and stuff just by,
eating
osmosis. I mean,
right.
It takes work, Yeah. That you should be proud of that. You should be, and if people admire it, it's only because it's a beautiful thing to admire, So I honestly think that, there's this double standard. Football has had scantily clad cheerleaders in the sport ever since its inception. There's girls running around, high school girls, doing flips and spreads and all the, everything. And they turn a blind eye to it. And the fact is that football is a gladiator sport. It's a very violent sport. You would know also what happens under the pile when people get all bit up and everything trying to get the pigskin. So I totally understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to invoke this double standard, and it's like, and create like this, it's that evil, it's like there was a commercial that had a couple of drag queens in it. And it was just a little 20-second blurb of a larger commercial, and they got all up in arms about it. It's like, I can't let my children see it, and it's like, it was just comedy and drag.
Context for what it was, like, was it a RuPaul Drag Race commercial, or
it was for Sabra hummus?
Hummus, yeah.
And basically, it was just one vignette of like a 2-minute long commercial that had little snippets of different things going on, and basically it was just two drag queens eating hummus, and one of them made a joke about having helmet head, trying to put the helmet on or something. And it was really silly.
I mean, it sounds like nonsensical to get like up and
it wasn't sexualized or anything, but you'll find it if you go Google search one, and it'll just say, the decadence, the NFL should be ashamed of themselves to allow a commercial that has drag queens in it. It's like, gosh, why don't you guys clean up your porn problem?
Like back in the day when women were not allowed to appear on stage, when they did the plays.
Men played the roles
of both women and men, and they wore drag.
Shakespeare and Greek theater. I mean, it's...
Yeah, crazy stuff.
They still reenact in the Feast of Purim, the Jews, they still reenact by wearing women's clothing of the whole, story of Queen Esther, So, I mean, it's really sad.
Yeah.
What's taking place, this double standard.
With the Shakira and the performance, like, I can totally get behind. The only little small hang up I will, kind of point out is that, like, historically, people like women, especially in like high school and collegiate settings, there's been a lot of pressure by society to be expected to engage in like that sort of performance, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you're an attractive female and you're in high school, then you're expected to be a cheerleader. Like, that is the expectation that society puts on you, whether or not you want it, right? And so, like, to the extent that there are, Shakira and whoever else performed, because I didn't watch it, like, to the extent that those people were there because they wanted to do that and they wanted to celebrate their bodies and they wanted to go out there and like strut their stuff and all that, that's awesome, right? I just always, like, with those sort of performances, I do make a point to just make sure that, like, we are creating that space for them because it is what they want and not because we're kind of forcing it on them as a society, right? Like, that's sort of the problem with porn nowadays, right? Is that there are lots of porn workers who do genuinely enjoy their work, but there's also a big risk with people who get into porn, like, that they get into a very abusive sort of environment, right? Where they're forced to do things or really pressured to do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do, enter into really harmful deals. You know, like there's a lot of problems that they face, and there's a lot of other people who talk a lot more about that, you know, have more experience than I do. But, you know, just when we're talking about like cheerleaders in this capacity, right? Like I'm all for it. It's all good, just as long as that's what they want.
Well, as long as the person is consenting and they want to do it, they're doing it because of their passion, because they love doing it. When I see individuals say, oh, women are being, you know, exploited, it's like they want to do it. No one's forcing them to do it. They enjoy their art. They're artists. They're singer, dancers, and they're performing, and they're loving what they're doing. So,
right.
I mean, it's, yeah.
But it's like, you know, it's always something. And ever since, you know, gay marriage got passed, there's just been this hell-bent desire to just topple everything that LGBT people have accomplished in the last 30 plus years, you know, so that, you know, they're trying to get children to not be able to transition earlier, and getting doctors to not be able to do their jobs as transitioning these children and stuff that need it. I mean, what do you think about that?
So, I mean, like these are things, fortunately, I do follow the progression of the law because that's going to be my job someday. So this is very reminiscent of the law that was overturned in Roe v. Wade, right? Very similar circumstances. Like the law did not punish people like women who went and sought to get abortions. It specifically punished the doctors, right? And so the lawsuit actually initially wasn't brought by Roe. It was actually a third-party representation by the doctors who were being, you know, prosecuted under the law, right? And so you have sort of this repeat of history, right, where, you know, technically you're not going to be prosecuting if these laws were to come to pass, the children who would be seeking this, you know, very necessary medical care. But you'd be punishing doctors for doing their job, right? For following the Hippocratic Oath, for doing what they're supposed to, providing life-saving service to people who need it, right? And so it's a really tragic situation because you know that we got here. Like, you know that the people who are writing these laws don't know the first thing about trans people, right? Like that's really the tragedy of it, is that you have a bunch of rich white old men, and let's face it, that's what they are. Maybe minor exceptions here and there. Broadly speaking, that's who we're talking about, who make these laws because they seem popular to their constituents in largely Republican areas, right? That's what we're talking about. Because apparently it's the flavor of 2020 to bash on trans youth, right? That's the flavor of the year. Because apparently there's a couple different states who are all pushing the same sort of bill, and it's not making me feel great. Right. I can talk from personal experience and say I did not feel like the option was available to me when I was younger to be able to pursue transition because of where society was. Society is very different nowadays. And if the only thing that could prevent me from being able to pursue medical transition when I was that young was just the laws put in place by people who were bigoted and didn't know better, that would be infinitely more harmful to me and my mental health and my well-being than any sort of possible negative effect, most of which are null that the lawmakers try to cite. None of that would pale in comparison to the harm that law would cause me, right? So that's sort of my hot 2 cents as both someone who is studying the law and someone who has some experience on that matter.
Well, luckily the one in Florida didn't even.
It's been tabled.
And
not be able to.
Yeah, I just think, again, that's
South
coming
Dakota,
from a lot
I don't
of.
know if that one is still.
I think a lot of it started off with that big case that was between two parents that were actually feuding in Texas. Yeah. They were feuding. It was like a marriageable type of thing, and they took it upon themselves to deal with the child who was trans, and the father didn't want it, and the mother did, and so obviously they took out that feud on the poor child, and that sparked a lot of the stuff that we're seeing today. And you know, it's unfortunate that people can't understand that if you're alleviating things that by blocking the hormones or your puberty, that's going to help you in the long run be able to transition easier. And things like your voice, you know, facial hair and things of that sort, that
Right.
later on in life, it's a lot more difficult to deal with. You know, these people aren't thinking that. You know, they're calling it child abuse. They're just like going on their own limited belief, and it's pretty sad.
Marcy was asking a question. She was asking, how do you all view transitioning very young before puberty hits? I see pros and cons.
So can I say something on this?
Yeah, go right ahead, please.
So most people who talk about prescribing some degree of medical care to let's say under 16 trans people, no one's ever talking about giving them hormones, right? The conversation is always about whether or not to give them puberty blockers. Plain, simple, like that's it, right? And the conversation is basically that people prescribe hormone blockers to be able to delay the effects of puberty to such an age, let's say like 16 or 18, depending on what statutes are made or enforced, where people feel that children are sufficiently of age to be able to decide for themselves whether or not they want to pursue transition. This seems like a very amenable situation or a compromise to me, right? Because you don't want to be giving hormones to underage children. I agree with people. And I think that's where, conservative or people who are more moderate, who don't know any better, like that's where the criticism comes from. They're always like, you hear people talking about, oh, they're shoving hormones in the kids. No one's doing that. It's a straw man argument. It's just not a thing. Right. But then there's also the fact that really, younger trans people, yes, they want to be able to transition eventually. But I think that speaking from personal experience, the larger issue is just being able to address and hopefully prevent the effects of, the effects of puberty. Right. Like when I was growing up, sure, I would have wanted to go through female puberty. And that's something that was great. But what I would have appreciated much more was just stopping the effects of male puberty, right? And just preventing that. And that could have saved me so much time and effort and money and heartache in the long run. And I think that's something. And the nice thing about that is that where science is at right now, if you put kids on puberty blockers for a couple of years and eventually, let's say that they go on puberty blockers, they're on it for a couple of years. Eventually they're like, actually, this whole trans thing, I'm not about it. I'm not trans. I'm going to stop. They can just go off the blockers and just puberty will pick back up where it left off. Right. And everything is fine and no one is hurt and everyone has done the best things to ensure the mental well-being of the child. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm at.
I think they're picking on this because again, it's an LGBT hot button issue because you've got, I remember when those my cousins weren't developing as boys should be developing and they were giving them shots to help boost their testosterone level and they were younger. Sure. No one had a problem with that or puberty blocker has been used in other situations to help with certain precocious type of puberty and no one ever had an issue with that. Children are immunized from a very young age, given all sorts of different chemicals. No one has an issue with that. They're promoting it. So this is just something that they're just picking on people that, because again, gay marriage went through. So this is let's pick on, trans individuals. And they're also saying, well, what if there's a lot of detransitioners that are coming out of the woodwork right now? Well, I believe that people should be allowed to experience their journey. There's no such thing as a bad journey or a good journey. It's your journey. You make mistakes, you clean your knees up and you keep going. And it's part of your spiritual growth. There's things that happen in life and we may not have wanted it to happen, but in the end, it was something good.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. So I would 100% agree. These are arguments in bad faith, right? Let's just cut it. It's all arguments in bad faith. You're completely right. People have been using hormones on children at young ages since forever. I mean, if you want to get really into the woodworks, I mean, you could make a similar parallel to cutting the foreskin off of penises. Dang it. Exactly. Where does the circumcision? Yeah. I mean, people, if people talked about giving gender confirming surgery to, young trans girls, then people would lose their minds. But, everyone's, fine with drawing this arbitrary line, right? This is, that mutilation of genitals, that's fine. But anything else, oh no, that goes against what I'm used to, right? So it very much is a bad faith argument, right? And I think that's easy enough for most people with, I don't want to be demeaning, but more than half a brain to recognize, right? More to I'm sorry, more to your second point. I'm sorry, I lost it for a second. I was so on about younger trans people. Oh, detransitioners. Yeah, there's definitely a much greater sort of trend lately in the media where you have people being blasted who have detransitioned, right? And unfortunately, what you have is something like it's a symptom of what we talked about earlier, right? The people who are heard most often in society are not the people who are right. They are the people who are the loudest, right? Mm-hmm. And what you have is like a small percentage of trans people, or rather people who transition and eventually realize that they aren't trans. And that's going to happen just by the laws of statistics, right? And unfortunately, when that happens, big right-wing groups are going to pick them up because they're vultures and they want to use whatever tools they can to try and tread on trans people. And they're going to blast these people's stories as loud as they can. And it doesn't matter whether or not what those detransitioned people say is right. All that matters is that they're saying it louder than people who have transitioned and who are happy with their lives and who are, perfectly content being trans and all that.
Exactly.
I mean, I can speak to what effects not being able to transition earlier has done to my life. Mm-hmm. I turned 50 today. I have 5 children from a previous marriage. Wow. A marriage that should never have been, because had I been allowed to transition at a young age, I would never have even ventured into that. And only because of the expectations that society had upon me, and those expectations of religion and Christianity, those were the things that drove me to have to do or feel that I needed to do what I had to do. And so now I live without any children, in my life. My ex has made it a point for me not to be able to have any contact with them. I now live a life that is not the optimal in the sense of family. We lose family. Mark and I both, we have no mother, no father, basically. Mm-hmm. We have no extended family. We live here and we are our own family to each other, and that's it. I watch his back and he watches mine, and but had we been able to transition earlier,
things would be different.
Things would be much different. Of course everything would be different, but I'm just saying in the sense of late transitioners, there's a hell of a lot to pay. The cost of transition, not just for, people wanting you to have all the surgeries so that you look appropriately anatomically female, but also all of the loss that one incurs along the way with relationships and family and people and children, in my case, and future grandchildren, all of that is just, and how do you reconcile that as a trans woman, that you would actually be someone's dad or grandfather? It just doesn't see. That's where these Christian fundamentalists and other right-wingers, conservatives, don't understand that, or radical feminists, they don't understand that this is much more in nuance than what they would want to understand.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of these problems, so a lot of those circumstances are very unfortunately sort of products of society, right? Because I mean, like, people who are trans have been around since forever, right? Like, that's a constant. What's changed is that recently society has become more accepting to trans people, right? And so we're starting, just sort of an unfortunate circumstance where it's become much, like you have much more acceptance and a larger progression of acceptance over this, like the last 50, 100 years of, in general, right? And that means that some people are only going to be able to transition later because they were in a society that wasn't going to really permit them to do so earlier without severe consequences. And really what all that is like, there's a lot of hurt in that. And I don't want to devalue that. And that, you know, at some degree, like I can't relate to that because like I'm not, you know, I didn't have any children. I don't come from that sort of experience. But it's also really cool because you come from an experience that's very different from a lot of people, and you're able to sort of share that story with me and with other people, so that, you know, hopefully you can preclude and help people, you know, not be in that same sort of a position. One of the most important people that I've ever met was actually a transgender priest down in Memphis who transitioned when she was, and I kid you not, like 78, right?
Wow.
Like she was very old, right? And
Yeah.
she is one of the best people I've ever come to know, right? She's my spiritual guide, and I talk to her as much as I'm able to. Unfortunately, lately she's been dealing with health problems. But there is so much that I was able to learn from her because she experienced so much in life, and hopefully I'll be able to incorporate that and to be able to share that experience with others and share what I learned with her with other people without having to go through the same sort of issues myself, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of hurt with your experience, and I sympathize with that. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that, but you know, there's good that can come out of it as well, at least in my humble opinion.
No, I agree. I agree. But the lessons have been, you know, for a reason, and for a purpose. So, I mean, I'm just grateful. There's so many trans individuals, and I know that maybe on another time that we have you on, you could talk about your personal relationship prior and stuff like that, and just how that affected, you know, coming out and relating and all that stuff, because I'm sure that there's a lot to unwind there too. We all just want to be able to kind of help each other out. You know, we want to use these times as a way to just allow people to just hash out those feelings and those thoughts, and to be able to possibly help someone else that's going through the same type of thing.
Yeah, I totally get that. And hey, I'd be more than happy to talk about those experiences another time. This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to take this time to thank all the chatters, even the ones with the negative comments, because we all learn, you know, we all learn. I believe hurt people. That's, you know, that's something. And a lot of these individuals that use the Bible as a sword and use God as a weapon, they're confused and hurting inside themselves. You know, they have something they're dealing with, something they're battling, and it's easy to point fingers at someone instead of going like this, you know. So
yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. All right. So
thank you so much, Riley. It's been
thank you both. This was wonderful. And I'm going to go work on my paper now. That's due in like 10 days. Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time and for being part of our podcast. So take care. You all have a good night. See you soon.
Bye.
Love you. But remember to always love yourselves too. Have a good night.
Bye.